Hi, I am Chef Nakia and welcome to the Culinary Time Machine. In this show, we explore the history of food and the evolution of cooking and the impact that our relationship with food and cooking have on the trajectory of human evolution and civilization, how we got to be where we are today. And this is episode 2 of season 1, and in this episode we are going to be talking about the benefits that cooked food had on human evolution and the trajectory of the evolution of human society. Okay, so I'm going to kind of split this episode into 2 parts. It'll all be here in the same video. But I am going to begin by discussing how the discovery of cooking and humans' ability to consume cooked food more often impacted human civilization in a more broad sense, like from a general population. And then the second half, I'm going to just talk more about the individual's potential perspective from back when this was going on. And apparently Smokey wanted to join also to discuss this topic. It is pretty fitting though, because cats and other animals did have an impact on, humans' ability to grow civilizations also, because cats are really good mousers, and maybe not this one, but others are, and that absolutely did have an impact. However, we're kind of skipping ahead if we talk about that, because by the time that happens, we are in more of an agriculture-focused society and not really hunter-gatherers as much. So I appreciate you, Kitty, but I think we're gonna have to bring you back for a later episode. All right. So yes, if we look at the timeline of human history, the topics that we're discussing in this episode take place in the Stone Age, still before agriculture and before the slow change from humans primarily living in hunter-gatherer societies to primarily living in agriculture-based societies. So we're going hunter-gatherer, keep that in mind here. So if we go back to 780,000-ish years ago to the first archaeological evidence of cooking, and we think about how humans evolved from that point over into the next couple 100,000 years, we can see these tiny changes from generation to generation or over multiple generations really stacked up over hundreds of thousands of years to actually make a noticeable difference. One of the biggest benefits that cooking our food had on us as a species is with cooked food, our bodies are able to more readily digest that food and utilize more of the nutrients in the food. So eating 100% raw food all of the time, your body is only capturing a percentage of the nutrients available. Now with cooked food, our bodies are still only, metabolizing a percentage of the nutrients available, but it is more easily digested, which means that that percentage can increase. And even in modern times, we don't all digest food the same way, right? We all have different metabolisms, and depending on a lot of different factors, our bodies will metabolize and absorb nutrients from foods at different capacities. So this is why this type of topic, when we talk about it over a general population, we're really talking about habitual actions over multiple generations of people adding on top of each other to eventually see a result. So this ability for our bodies to be able to more easily digest food and gain more nutrients from food is one of the things that scientists believe took us from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. And so really, if you think about Homo sapiens as a species, this ability to gain more nutrients from our food made the species. Because of these additional nutrients, our bodies did not need to work so hard to break down the food, and that means there's more energy available for us to grow taller, our muscle mass to become more dense, not to mention our brains. With additional energy and nutrients available, our brains could grow in size and we could, become smarter. As a species, we could collectively become smarter. Now, again, this isn't happening from one generation to the next. This is over tens of thousands of years. Another thing that more nutrient density in a population's diet will provide is the ability to repopulate in a more dense way. That's probably not the right way to say it. This means that you can support larger populations. So if a hunter-gatherer group before was, 20 or 30 people in a band, and you no longer need quite as much volume of food to keep those 20 or 30 people alive, then it's much more likely that infants will be able to survive to adulthood. With bands of hunter-gatherers being able to support larger numbers of people and therefore have denser population, you may also be able to have more of a sharing and then growth of knowledge, right? If one person notices a natural phenomenon and they share it with 40 other people instead of 20 other people, well, then you have 40 other people also potentially noticing that phenomenon and wondering, what does this mean? And on and on. And I'm not trying to say that there were a bunch of Aristotles and Newtons hanging out, because again, the size and complexity of our brains has evolved, and so the capacity at which we have consciousness and we have complex thought also has evolved. So it's not like I'm saying that as soon as people could eat cooked food, they were studying the stars and becoming astronomers and figuring out that all animals are made out of cells. But the more brains you have focusing on the same, subject or occurrence, the more likely it is that some type of conclusion will be drawn and that can be tested the next time. And if it holds true, then you have more people learning that if this action occurs, then this result is likely. And that type of sharing of information is another huge part that is going to help humans evolve to, create writing and currency and cities and all of these, inventions and get us to where we are today. It has to start somewhere. And with in our minds today, it feels like the most basic of cause and effect correlations, but really, really important for, the genesis of Homo sapiens. All right, so we have more efficient nutrient absorption with cooked food. And on the flip side of that, we also have a reduction in the risk for foodborne illness. Even today, we have potentially hazardous foods, which are meats and fish. Any animal that was once alive is going to have a higher risk of making us sick. Therefore, we, cook our meats before eating them. So there's a long list of potentially hazardous foods, including, fish and animals and animal byproducts. And so if we have the ability to cook a fish, then any microbes or bacteria that were infecting that fish, it is much less likely that, we will get sick. And back in those days, foodborne illness very well could have meant death. Today, we maybe experience food sickness a dozen or two times during our lifetime. Back then, it might have just been once, because one situation where you lose a lot of fluids and become very dehydrated and you don't have maybe the means to rehydrate yourself appropriately, and you may perish. So being able to reduce the risk of foodborne illness could have had a huge impact in the lifespan of humans, and the ability of humans to continue reproducing, to then also create a denser population, more ideas together. All of these things are just going to build one on top of the other, of better nutrition, larger brains, more problem-solving skills, to share more ideas, to go find better food, better sources of food, more consistent sources of food, on and on over hundreds of thousands of years. You can see how humans evolved into Homo sapiens, and it takes a very long time and many, many, many generations, but cooked food is in many ways one of the pillars of what separates us. It is a huge factor in what allowed humans to be the species that invented agriculture and the wheel and a writing system and language. 780,000 years ago, we have evidence that people were cooking. So that is what we would consider like when humans begin cooking. As I discussed in the last video, I believe that there could have been many, many occurrences of humans cooking before there is the evidence for it, but because that's where the evidence lies, that is where we can begin assuming that the people here around this lake were cooking, and potentially, people in other areas of the world were also already putting their food over fire in order to reduce the risk of foodborne illness and increase the nutrient density. Now, it's not like they knew that they were doing that as they were doing it, but that was the result that we have benefited from for hundreds of thousands of years to follow. Now, and then there is some archaeological evidence of people near the Sea of Galilee with seeds of like ember wheat and peas and barley and olives and grapes, along with grinding tools, like stone grinding tools, that make scientists believe that they were in the very, very early stages of figuring out agriculture, of testing out agriculture. And these date back to 19,000, almost 20,000 years ago. So from 780,000 years ago when we began cooking food to 20,000 years ago where Homo sapiens, humans, began saying like, oh, as we're hunting and gathering, is there actually a way that we can remain more sedentary and try to control what grows here near us? That is, 760,000 years. So many generations of people there. Oh my goodness. What might have the average day looked like for a early human living during that time? We eat typically like 3 meals a day. I know some people do more of like 5 or 6 meals, or some people will do maybe 1 or 2 meals. But let's just assume that most of us are eating 3 meals, maybe some snacks in between. If we are eating 3 times a day, that means that there are 3 opportunities for us to feel emotion, to feel like the satisfaction and pleasure and the opportunity for creative output, potentially like a way to show people that we love them. It's art. Food is also, and cooking is a science, so it could also be an opportunity for us to, embrace a scientific principle or a teaching moment. If we experience that 3-ish times a day, every day, that's over 1,000 times a year. So let's say 80,000 to 100,000 opportunities in our lifetime to feel this connection with food and cooking that goes beyond just like inputting for energy, right? Even whenever you feel like you're in a situation where you're stressed and it is like convenience over everything else, hopefully you are still noticing the flavors and the textures and finding some joy in that meal. Okay, so when you look at this vast amount of time between when we began cooking food and when maybe agriculture was beginning to peek out here and there. On our timeline, where we have a 6-hour pasta dish in relation to the amount of time from when humans began migrating out of Africa to the Asian continent. If that is the beginning of this timeline, start marinating our meat to cook our meal, and at the end of it is where we are today, then us beginning to cook food is right where our slow cooked meat and pasta sauce is still cooking. We go from there until whenever agriculture, the dawn, we'll call it the dawn of agriculture. That's gonna cover the amount of time that we are making our pasta. And we're making this pasta dough from scratch. So we've got our flour and our salt, and we got our eggs, and we're mixing it all together. We're gonna knead that together really well, and then that pasta dough needs to rest because if you go straight from kneading your pasta dough to trying to cook your pasta dough, it's gonna feel a little tough. You gotta let all the gluten in there get nice and relaxed and happy. So that's gonna rest. And then we'll pull it back out of the fridge and we'll start rolling it out. We need to roll it thinly, and because we're making ravioli, we gotta, put the filling in there and cut them and seal them, all of that good stuff. And so really up until we are cooking our pasta, the pasta formation process, that's gonna be equivalent to the amount of time from when we have archaeological evidence that we began cooking food and the next phase, we'll say, of human evolution, which would be moving from hunter-gatherers to agriculture-based societies. Little note about that is it wasn't like one day we were all hunter-gatherers, one person started sowing a field, and then the next day we are all immediately farmers because somehow we knew this is the correct trajectory. There is really no correct or incorrect trajectory, right? It's just what ended up happening. But agriculture, in an individual's life, it wouldn't have really felt easier to be a farmer than to be a hunter-gatherer. It wouldn't have felt like there was much of a benefit there. And over time, there would have been many failed attempts at agriculture. So potentially bands of hunter-gatherers maybe doing some hunter-gathering and doing a little bit of, picking specific seeds and trying to care for them so that they will grow and maintain those crops, and then a drought coming and they have to leave. And so in that way, the agriculture failed. It's a much more fluid back and forth. It isn't going from hunter-gatherer to agriculture or to agrarian society and never going back to hunter-gatherer. And depending on what part of the world we're talking about, this is gonna happen on a very different time frame. There were hunter-gatherer societies in the modern times too. As we continue with this timeline and talk about the dawn of agriculture and whatnot, keep in mind that it is very much a fluid back and forth, and it really depends on what area of the world you're talking about. And just like most of what we're talking about, especially in this episode about human evolution, it is little tiny actions built up over hundreds and hundreds of generations. And some of those generations would have found some success in, crops or in caring for crops and, animal husbandry and trying to domesticate animals, and others would have moved towards a hunting and gathering trajectory and then back and forth, and it's more of a snake river than a straight water pipe. So what would the benefits of cooking have looked like from a more individual perspective, right? We talked about what it looks like for the general population and all of those little changes built up over time, over many generations of people. But for the individual, what if we put ourselves in their shoes they may not have been wearing shoes, but you know, their feet, and thought about it for a moment. So this is what I visualize as a potential of what could have been happening, and I would love to hear what you think may have been going on in the average person's life sometime between 780,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago. So you are born into a band of hunter-gatherers. You have no written language, simple sounds and gestures and body language. Maybe a third of your waking time is spent pursuing food, pursuing a meal. Maybe you eat a couple times a day. Maybe you eat like a meal on average once every 2 to 3 days, and the rest of your food consumption could be more equivalent to snacking is today. You spend maybe a third of your time like socializing and grooming and like chores, what we would maybe consider chores, right? Cleaning up the space around you. And then a third spent in leisure, you know, maybe daydreaming, watching the clouds go by, watching an animal near you and seeing what they do, what their behaviors are like. Or with hunter-gatherer bands, oftentimes, you know, they were migrating and moving from place to place to follow where the most readily accessible food was, right? They were searching that out. It's not like they necessarily knew, but they were searching out like, okay, what seems like the place with the most abundance? So, you know, maybe you were walking a lot too, right? You were migrating. Your days were full of like migrating from one place to another and trying to find places to rest. So it's not really clear what level of consciousness you may have, right? To what extent have our brains developed? However, you do have a lot of time and space to notice the small things going on around you. Something that in modern times, we don't really have the luxury of much time and space to notice the little things, right? There's a lot of really big things that we think about all day, every day. But hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years ago, you aren't going to be asking yourself about quantum physics. You're going to be thinking, oh, that, you know, the color of that leaf is so subtly different than the color of that leaf. And you may not even draw any sort of conclusion or have any wonder thought about that, but really just like that noticing. Like I try to put myself in the place of somebody who we would consider today as like a deprivation of sensory, but really it's just that, you know, there's not much music. We don't have bright lights. We don't have videos, obviously. There's so much less to occupy our brain space. And so I believe that it's very likely that humans were picking up on the almost imperceptible differences in nature and the world around them. Based on the appearance of like the berries and the bush and the leaves, you may know which berries will be the most delicious. Those are probably going to be the sweeter ones, but you're not going to know that bricks, like the measure of sugar in fruit, increases over time until it starts to, until it like falls off of the bush or it starts to rot, right? You're not going to understand the full like science, the full like life cycle behind and like what even sugar is, but you'll pick up that berry and eat it, and you'll have some type of sensory perception saying like, this one is tastier than that other one that was kind of sour, even if you don't have a word for sour, right? But there's a perception that language has not necessarily been created yet to depict. Right? Based on the current of the river, maybe the color of the water, the texture of the dirt around the river, the behaviors of the fish that you're watching move through, you may decide that, oh, today is going to be a great day for fishing. I can catch some of these. Or you may decide this is not the right conditions, and I'm going to find another way to fill my belly today that feels less labor intensive, right? I'm more likely to be able to fill my belly in a different way. It's just interesting to me to think about how many different little details our human ancestors may have been picking up on. So it would be this like relatively quiet, but really, really intimate understanding of the world around us that would have led to so many decisions and so many like behaviors in your individual day. So then imagine one day your band meets up with a different band of hunter-gatherers, and it could be a violent meeting, it could be a not violent meeting. In my visualization, I'm gonna say it's not. People are nice to each other. And through, limited language, body language, gestures, you can communicate. They can communicate to you all that there is a, herd of elk over yonder, and maybe they don't have enough hunters to bring down an elk. But if, everybody works together, then maybe you all can feast on elk. So maybe you both can see the benefit of working together to go follow that herd of elk and, hunt together and bring more food, right, for everybody to eat. And maybe that band of hunter-gatherers has seen others cooking, and they may start cooking some elk, and that may be the first time that you've seen food over fire. And then you have an opportunity to eat it and you realize, oh my gosh, this is different. Oh, this is new. This is, whoa. And you as an individual, you're not gonna know that there's bacteria and yeast and mold that can cause our food to spoil and cause us to get sick. So you're not gonna know, oh yeah, I'm gonna benefit from no longer getting foodborne illness, right? But what's in it for you is a new experience, new flavors, and it may be easier to chew, and your body may feel better digesting it too. So once you've experienced cooked food once, you're probably going to experiment with putting all kinds of different things over that fire and saying like, ooh, what happens if I cook this catfish? So you're probably just gonna keep, putting different things over fire to see how it turns out. Until one day you either forget that you put something over the fire, or it cooks so much quicker than you expected, you end up burning it to a point where it's really bitter and it is inedible. And then you say, oh no, I had available food and I ruined it. So I don't wanna do that again, right? Once you burn your hard-earned food to a crisp and it becomes inedible, then you proceed with caution. And this is the foundation for reasoning and cause and effect and the invention of recipes, right? You will cook something and be able to eat it, and then remember, okay, I want to do that again the next time and the next time. And you will cook something and not be able to eat it, and then be like, I'm never doing that again. And that like handing down of process from person to person, generation to generation, that's the beginning of recipes. That is, telling another person, well, this is how I prepared this food to be this way. And so I believe that ever since we started cooking, people have been asking each other for recipes. When's the last time you went to a potluck or something and took an amazing dish and you have like 4, 5, 6 people asking you, oh, send me the recipe. Like, share that recipe with me, right? It's something that I think has probably been in our human existence for hundreds of thousands of years, because whenever we have a resource as precious as food, we don't want to risk ruining it. And ideally, we want it to be as pleasurable and as enjoyable as possible. So I believe that the benefits of humans cooking food, yes, of course, include the basics of, and very like science focused, like reducing the risk of foodborne illness and increasing the nutrient density and like our digestion, our ability to digest and absorb more nutrients, which then led to our bodies being able to grow more into what they, have become. And I also believe that cooking food created a side of culture that encouraged people to share more, to want to communicate better, because with more improved means of communication, you can create more pleasurable experiences with food and also reduce the risk of ruining a resource that is so, so important. And before humans were cooking, yes, we were eating and we were eating food and we were wanting to communicate about food, of course, and like where to go get the best mushrooms, or when this, something tends to sprout and be delicious and whatnot. Of course, but cooking just adds that extra element of human interaction and the ability to control more aspects of your food, because as you cook it, you can choose to cook it lower and slower, or hotter and quicker, or to like a well done state versus a less well done state. But the experimentation needed to cook, is this the first scientific experimentation? Is this the first time that humans set up an experiment and studied the results of a physical interaction? Could it be that cooking is the original scientific experiment? So that is our overview of how cooking has benefited human evolution and the trajectory of human civilization. I guess we haven't really even gotten into the civilization part, but you can see how everything we talked about today is so important as building blocks to what civilization will be built upon. So thank you so much for watching. Like and follow and subscribe and follow along. Well, you know what I mean. I appreciate you all so, so much. Join us in 2 weeks as we discuss how food affects conflict and conflict affects food. How they affect one another. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Culinary Time Machine.